Susie was the most wonderful copy editor. I submitted this article that was way too long, and she helped me cut it down to a manageable size for the magazine. Okay. Where's all my little, Brian, where are you? Where's my little clicker here?
That's what she calls me, the little clicker.
Oh, okay, yeah, okay, that's okay. The Cracker Jack, in business from 1907 to 1974, was New Orleans' most famous and longest-running hoodoo drugstore. New Orleans is often associated with voodoo, a legitimate Afro-Catholic religion that developed here in the 18th and 19th century. Elsewhere in the Anglo-Protestant South, African-descended people practiced a system of magic known as hoodoo to ensure beneficial interactions with lovers, family, friends, customers, and employers, guard against those who intended harm, confound enemies, and bring good luck. Am I talking into this microphone? Can you all hear me?
Yeah.
In New Orleans, by the turn of the 20th century, the voodoo religion had been forced underground by lawmakers, public opinion, and the church. But believers continued to practice a distinctly New Orleans style of hoodoo. These practitioners found the necessary supplies at what came to be called the Hoodoo Drugstore. Such places were usually operated by a white, professionally trained pharmacist who, in response to customer requests, began to formulate magical potions. A display at the New Orleans Pharmacy Museum provides an idea of what would have been sold at an early hoodoo drugstore. A notebook dated 1910 is filled with handwritten recipes. The Pharmacy Museum also exhibits brown glass screw-top jars bearing hand-lettered labels for various hoodoo concoctions. The only known photograph of the Cracker Jack is this 1951 illustration from Ebony magazine. I found no pictures of the interior of the Cracker Jack, but it might have looked something like this drugstore in Vicksburg, Mississippi, that I visited while writing my book, Spiritual Merchants. The Cracker Jack drugstore was owned by George Andre Thomas, a Tulane-educated doctor with a specialty in urology. In 1906, Thomas bought a two-story brick store building at 435 South Rampart Street, and the following year he opened his pharmacy there and lived in the upstairs apartment. In 1909, Thomas bought two more buildings. One of them, 41315 South Rampart, became the Iroquois Theater, a vaudeville house that featured African-American touring acts, local performance, and motion pictures for black audiences. The other, 427 South Rampart, was adjacent to his drugstore. Within a few years, he had rented this building to the Karnofsky family, beloved in Jeff's history as the benefactors and surrogate parents of a neighborhood boy named Louis Armstrong. One of the Karnofsky sons had a tailoring business at 427 South Rampart, and the entrance still bears a blue and white tile marker set into the sidewalk. All of these buildings were located in Square 297, bounded by the 400 blocks of South Rampart and Basin and the 1,100 blocks of Perdido and Poitras. In 1925, Dr. Thomas transferred all of his property in Square 297 to the Diana Realty Company, a corporation founded by Thomas and two other shareholders. Keep that fact in mind, because that's going to be important. Thomas continued to operate the Cracker Jack at 435 South Rampart and to act as landlords for the other buildings. During the During the early decades of the 20th century, Square 297 and the surrounding area would play a significant role in the development of jazz. Nightclubs and social halls featured the most important jazz performers of the day, such as Buddy Bolden, Louis Armstrong, A.J. Perron, Papa Celestin, and John Robichaux. The Zulu Social Aid and Pleasure Club Mardi Gras Parade started on South Rampart, and it was there that the Baby Dolls masking tradition began. On New Year's Eve, 1913, young Louis Armstrong shot up a handgun in front of the Eagle Saloon at the corner of South Rampart and Perdido and landed in the Colored Wave Zone. And around the time that Dr. Thomas opened his drugstore, New Orleans authorities launched a crackdown on cocaine trafficking. Investigators found that many dealers were illegally obtaining cocaine from local pharmacies. The Crackerjack attracted police notice in 1910 because of a suspicious number of cocaine sales to a man named Whitmire. Charles Lindsay, a clerk at the drugstore, confessed that over a period of several months, he had frequently filled cocaine prescriptions for Whitmire written by Dr. Thomas. Thomas and Lindsay were arrested, fined $25 each, and sentenced to 30 days in jail, but both managed to wriggle out of the charges. Thomas put the blame on Lindsay and denied having actually sold the cocaine, and Lindsay argued that he was merely an employee at Thomas's drugstore and was therefore not responsible for his actions. Thomas had already been married and divorced twice when he married French-born Alice Armand Vibart in 1912. In 1918, George and Alice and their 3 sons moved from their apartment above the Crackerjack to what is now the affluent Lakeview subdivision. These passport photos show the family in 1923 when they made a trip to Europe. It's unclear exactly when Dr. Thomas's establishment made the shift from an ordinary pharmacy to the city's most famous outlet for hoodoo supplies. But the Crackerjack was apparently operating as a hoodoo drugstore by the 1920s. On May 14, 1927, New Orleans newspapers published articles about the federal mail fraud investigation of a South Rampart Street physician for, quote, the distribution of love philters, charms, and voodoo magic in a widespread traffic in fake potions extending from New Jersey to Texas. One article reported that, quote, a voodoo practice with headquarters on South Rampart Street was exposed on Friday. The inspectors found the organization manipulated by an aged white physician. His practice has been entirely confined to Negroes, whose superstitious nature has enabled him to found a drugstore dealing with such articles as goofer dust, eagle eyes, and other charms for good and evil. The voodoo practitioner would mail out a catalog of charms purchasable at his drugstore only, end of quote. The newspapers made no further mention of the mail order fraud case against the aged white physician. His identity was never revealed, but I strongly suspect that he was Dr. George Thomas. I keep losing my advance button under here. A year later, in 1928, an article in the Item Tribune was headlined, Voodooism Still Thrives in New Orleans. Now, notice that they keep calling it voodoo instead of hoodoo. They just lumped it all together. They'd forgotten that voodoo is religion, hoodoo is magic, but that's just an aside. The writer described the neighborhood of South Rampart and Poydras Street where there was, quote, ample evidence of spirit worship and voodoo. You will see love potions and spirit charms displayed in a drugstore window. The accompanying cartoon depicted the proprietor of a Hoodoo drugstore, presumably Dr. Thomas, advising a customer. The Cracker Jack wasn't only about Hoodoo. Storyville, New Orleans' legally designated vice district, closed in 1917, but another haven for prostitution, called Black Storyville, continued to flourish near the South Rampart Street corridor. With prostitution came sexually transmitted diseases, and in 1929, the Cracker Jack published a little booklet titled The Complete Root Doctor, advertising their line of, quote, herbs, roots, barks, seeds, powders, incenses, spices, oils, essences, and candles. Cures for various ailments, especially syphilis and gonorrhea. The Cracker Jack sold Old 76, the standard remedy for unnatural discharges, and white seed powder for men only. Along with the ads for these cures, Dr. Thomas advised that, quote, no one can get well of any private disease unless he stops all sexual intercourse, abstains from alcoholic liquors, eats plenty of fresh green vegetables, and drinks lots of water. I bet I could pull this thing out. That's so much easier. The Complete Root Doctor also advertised Naturine tablets and Neurofort for what would now be called erectile dysfunction and treated with testosterone supplements. In the early 20th century, especially among Hoodoo practitioners, this condition was called loss of nature. Numerous Hoodoo rituals and prescriptions have been recorded for its alleviation. At some undetermined time, George Thomas began to suffer from mental illness. In September 1934, he was admitted to the East Louisiana State Hospital in Jackson. His wife, Alice Thomas, became president of Diana Realty Company while her husband was confined to the hospital. And in 1936, Diana Realty sold the Thomas's buildings on South Rampart to Louis August Morrow of St. Bernard Parish for $18,000. You all recognize that name?
Yeah.
When Morrow died in 1938, his estate passed to his only son, Joseph. The Morrows undoubtedly assumed that the central business district would advance across South Rampart and that all property in the way of this progress would greatly increase in value. Dr. Thomas, age 66, died at the East Louisiana State Hospital in 1940. His death certificate states that he had been there for 7.5 years and that he died from, quote, general paralysis of the insane. His estate settlement includes a 20-page inventory of the contents of the Cracker Jack's drugstore, including chemical compounds, drugs, flavorings, every imaginable dried root and herb. All had medicinal properties, but some were also used for magical purposes. The only items that definitely indicated that this was no ordinary drugstore were the lodestones and iron filings, horseshoes, incense burners, colored candles, Sacred Heart of Jesus badges, saints' pictures, books on hypnotism, palmistry, and dream interpretation, and the 6th and 7th books of Moses, a popular occult classic. In 1942, Alice Thomas married her old friend and fellow South Rampart Street merchant Morris Karnofsky, who had shortened his surname to Carno. She had known him since the Karnofskys became the Thomases' tenants and neighbors in 1914. Morris Carno was involved in his own enterprise, Morris Music House, a well-known source of jazz recordings and a hangout for musicians. Their union was short-lived. Carno died in 1944. Alice Thomas Carno continued to run the Cracker Jack with the help of her son Lucian. We know that it was still going strong in 1951 when it was featured in an Ebony magazine article. The writer described the drugstore as, quote, a rather forlorn and dismal looking place that has done a lucrative business for more than 2 generations and is still said to be one of the most popular sources of voodoo paraphernalia in New Orleans. The South Rampart Street commercial strip and surrounding residential neighborhood began to disappear in the mid-1950s. In November 1955, the Times-Picayune announced that, quote, in place of a slum, New Orleans would gain a new civic center, including an 11-story city hall, the adjacent civil district court, a park, a state office building, and a new main public library. In 1971, construction began on the Louisiana Superdome, which opened in 1975. Office towers in excess of 50 stories sprang up in the central business district. The Cracker Jack and other low-rise buildings were doomed. In March 1972, the New Orleans City Council authorized the demolition of number 441, 439, and 435 South Rampart. These buildings had, quote, become dilapidated and in a state of disrepair and had been declared a public nuisance. Many buildings on South Rampart had been vacant for years, but the Cracker Jack was still a thriving business until the time of the demolition. Lucian Thomas notified customers that the store had moved a few blocks away to the corner of South Freer and Cleveland. A Times-Picayune journalist visited the Cracker Jack around Halloween 1973 and described the merchandise: roots and herbs, powders, oils, baths, incense, red flannel bags, religious pictures, and colored candles. There were shelves lined with all kinds and shapes of bottles containing liquids and brown paper sacks filled with powders. Somebody, possibly Lucian Thomas, was filling Hoodoo prescriptions for customers at a counter at the rear of the store. The Cracker Jack closed for good in 1974. Alice Thomas Carno died the following year at age 87. Throughout the 1970s and 80s, the South Rampart Strip continued to deteriorate. 3 of the 4 remaining buildings in the 400 block were owned by the Arlene and Joseph Morrow Charitable Foundation, an entity created in 1992 after the death of Joseph Morrow. In 1993, jazz historians and preservationists, alarmed about the deterioration of these structures, submitted a landmark nomination. The Downtown Development District declined to support designation because this conflicted with the growth management plan for, quote, modern high-rise office and hotel development. Only in 2008 were the former Karnofsky store, the former Iroquois Theater, and the former Eagle Saloon designated as New Orleans landmarks, subject to the jurisdiction of the Historic District Landmarks Commission. And, you know, these buildings are right over here. Let's have some water. In 2002, before the landmark nomination was finalized, before the landmark nomination was finalized, an entrepreneur attempted to buy all 3 buildings from the Morrow Foundation with the idea of creating a New Orleans Music Hall of Fame. In 2007, he succeeded in acquiring the Eagle Saloon, but funding issues have stalled the project. The Little Gem Saloon at the corner of South Rampart and Poydras has been meticulously restored and opened last year as a fine restaurant and jazz club. How long have I been showing the wrong slide here? Okay, there's the Little Gem. And here's the Karnofsky store, the Iroquois Theater, and the Eagle Saloon. These were all taken last winter. And the view from above that I took from the 11th story of the Amico building, where the Historic District's Landmark Commission was located at the time. The Karnofsky store and Iroquois Theater buildings, still owned by the Morrows, stand crumbling and abandoned in a dreary no-man's land surrounded by looming skyscrapers and a vast expanse of parking lots. An out-of-town entertainment corporation has expressed interest in revitalizing the 400 block of South Rampart, but has not yet submitted any firm plans. Perhaps these early 20th century structures, so important to New Orleans' African-American jazz history, can be restored and converted to some appropriate purpose. But sadly, the Cracker Jack Drugstore is gone forever. Okay, that's it. Ask me questions.